All right, if you're listening to this, you probably want to know what's up with all the changes to Australian student visas, right?
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
Well, we're going to deep dive into the brand new Ministerial Direction 111 today.
Hot off the press.
Exactly.
Straight from the oven.
It is, and we're going to be pulling our key insights from the Koala News article, New Ministerial Direction 111, announced and in effect.
Published just yesterday, December 19th, 2024.
Yep.
Can't get much more timely than that.
Super fresh, and we're also going to be pulling in some extra context from the Sydney Morning Herald.
Give us a bit of a different perspective.
Exactly.
So MD111,
Yeah.
It's a pretty big shift.
Yeah, what is the deal with this Ministerial Direction 111? Why should we care about it?
So the new ministerial direction, it outlines like a whole new set of priorities for how the Australian government is going to process student visa applications.
Okay, so break it down for us.
It seems like on the surface, they want to create a system that feels more equitable for different kinds of educational institutions.
So that means regional universities and smaller colleges are getting a fairer shot.
That's the idea they're putting forward, but our friends at the Sydney Morning Herald suggest there might be another layer to this.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they're kind of hinting that the government might be trying to manage the number of international students coming into Australia.
Okay.
Potentially in response to concerns about housing and the cost of living.
So maybe not quite as simple as it looks at first glance.
Right.
There's some other things going on here.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, well, and speaking of things that aren't always straightforward, MD111 talks about indicative allocations.
Yeah.
What are those exactly, and why are they causing such a stir?
This is where it gets a little tricky.
Okay.
So the ministerial direction itself doesn't put a hard cap on how many students each institution can enroll.
Right.
But it introduces these indicative allocations for higher education providers and VET providers.
So universities and vocational education training.
Yeah, and it's like they're kind of acting like a limit, even though some people are questioning whether they have a clear legal basis.
So they're not officially caps, but they're kind of acting like caps in practice.
Yeah, that's one way to put it.
Okay, that sounds confusing.
It is, and the way they've set these allocations up, it seems to disadvantage private colleges and VET providers.
Okay, how so?
So, for example, the University of Sydney, a big public university, has a large CRECOS allocation.
And CRECOS allocation, that's like their total number of students they're allowed to enroll, right?
Exactly. Their total capacity for international students.
Got it.
And with this new indicative allocation, they can use a big chunk of that capacity.
Plenty of room for them.
Yeah, much more so than some of the private colleges and VET providers we looked at.
Like who?
Melbourne Polytechnic and IH Sydney Training Services, for example, both have significantly smaller indicative allocations compared to their overall CRECOS allocations.
So they don't have as much room to enroll international students. So we're seeing a potential imbalance here. The big universities might have an advantage under this new system.
Possible.
So is it really creating an even playing field, as the government is saying? Or is it actually tilting things in favor of certain institutions?
It's a good question, and it makes you think about the impact on the diversity of Australian international education.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because if certain institutions are facing more obstacles in attracting international students, it could lead to a less diverse and vibrant educational landscape overall.
Absolutely, and a diverse education sector benefits everyone.
Right, students and institutions, the Australian economy as a whole.
Yeah, encourages innovation, healthy competition.
Wider range of opportunities.
Yeah, exactly.
So we've got this system that's supposed to be all about efficiency and fairness.
Right.
But then there are these questions about how these indicative allocations are determined.
Yeah.
And whether they're really creating a level playing field. It just feels like there's a disconnect between the message and the actual impact.
You've hit the nail on the head, and that Sydney Morning Herald article really brings this disconnect to light.
Oh, how so?
They're suggesting that this focus on efficiency could actually be a way for the government to address concerns about immigration levels and domestic pressures.
So maybe efficiency isn't the only thing driving this.
Right.
Interesting. Okay, so we're seeing this interplay of factors here.
We are.
This push for efficiency, but then also potential political motivations, and then this complex impact on all these different parts of the education sector.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to unpack.
It is a lot to unpack.
And this is just the beginning. The full effects of MD111 are likely to play out over time, and we need to pay attention to how these changes affect students, institutions, and the Australian international education sector as a whole.
This is a lot for someone like me who's not like super up on all this stuff all the time.
Yeah.
What's the bottom line? Why should we care about these changes?
Well, it's important to remember that Australia's international education sector It's a huge part of the economy, and it attracts talent from all over the world. It enriches their cultural mix and helps build global connections.
So any changes to the rules around student visas have the potential to really shake things up.
For better or for worse.
Yeah, it's like a chain reaction.
Exactly.
Like what happens with visas, it doesn't stay isolated. It ripples out and affects the whole education landscape.
Absolutely. It impacts the students themselves, the institutions that rely on international enrollments, and even the broader Australian community.
Okay, so we've talked about who might benefit and who might lose out under these changes. But what about the government's stated goals? Do these changes actually make things more efficient and equitable?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
While the government's emphasizing streamlining processing and a level playing field, the reality seems much more nuanced.
Yeah,
Introducing these indicative allocations, especially without a clear legal foundation, seems to contradict the idea of a truly equitable system.
it does seem like there's this mismatch between what they're saying and what's actually happening.
And that Sydney Morning Herald piece really drives that point home.
Oh, yeah.
They're suggesting that this push for efficiency could actually be a way for the government to address concerns about immigration levels and domestic pressures.
So maybe efficiency isn't the only thing at play here.
Right.
So we're dealing with multiple agendas.
We are.
There's the push for efficiency, and then there are these potential political motivations, and then this complex impact on different parts of the education sector.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember we're only at the beginning of this story.
Yeah.
The full implications of MD111 are likely to unfold gradually, and we need to pay attention to how these changes affect students' institutions and the overall health of the Australian international education sector.
So where do we go from here? What does the future hold for Australian international education?
Another million-dollar question.
Right. Is this a step forward, a step back, or just a shuffle sideways?
Yeah, that's a tough one to answer definitively. The goal of creating a more efficient and fair system is certainly commendable,
Right.
but the key lies in the details. How these indicative allocations are implemented and managed will ultimately determine the success or failure of this new direction.
And the Sydney Morning Herald article kind of makes us wonder if efficiency is the primary driver or if there's something else going on.
Exactly. It's important to be aware of those underlying currents because the long-term impact of MD111 is still unfolding.
Right.
Will it lead to a streamlined and fair system as the government hopes, or will it trigger unforeseen consequences, potentially hindering the diversity and growth of the Australian international education sector?
Yeah, it feels like we're at a pivotal moment.
Absolutely.
The choices made now will have a lasting effect on the future of international education in Australia.
The stakes are high. It's essential for us to stay informed, engage in critical thinking, and hold our decision makers accountable for creating a system that genuinely benefits all stakeholders.
Well said. This deep dive has been incredibly insightful.
It's been great discussing it with you.
I feel like I have a much better grasp of these complex issues now.
Good. I hope our listener feels equipped to continue exploring these questions on their own.
I hope so too. And remember, this is just the beginning of the conversation. We'll continue to track this evolving story and keep you updated on any new developments.
It's a dynamic landscape.
So stay curious. Keep those brains engaged.
Speaking of staying engaged,
Yeah?
do you have any parting thoughts or questions that you think our listeners should consider?
Ooh, parting thoughts.
Yeah, we've talked about the goal of a more even playing field, but I can't help but wonder, could this new direction inadvertently widen the gap between large universities and smaller, more specialized institutions?
That's a really important point because it brings us back to that issue of diversity and whether a system that seems to favor larger institutions truly serves the best interests of the sector as a whole.
Exactly, and it raises broader questions about the government's role in shaping the landscape of international education in Australia.
Like what?
Well, are they genuinely committed to nurturing a diverse and vibrant sector, or are other priorities like managing immigration taking precedence?
Those are some really thought-provoking questions.
They are.
And they underscore the importance of staying informed and engaged in this ongoing conversation.
Absolutely. The future of Australian international education is at stake, and it's up to all of us to ensure it remains a thriving and diverse sector that benefits everyone involved.
Yeah, it feels like we're really at a crossroads here. The decisions that are being made right now are going to have a lasting impact on international education in Australia.
Yeah, you're right. The stakes are high. Got to stay informed, think critically about all this, and hold the policymakers accountable. Make sure they're really creating a system that benefits everyone.
Absolutely. This has been so eye-opening. I feel like I have a much clearer understanding now of how these technical changes can have a really big impact.
I know it's complicated stuff,
It is.
but it's important stuff.
It is, and I hope our listeners feel empowered to keep learning more about all this.
I hope so too. And, we've only just scratched the surface here. This is an evolving situation. It needs our attention.
Absolutely. We're going to keep following this story and bring you more updates as they come out. So stay curious, everyone. Keep those brains engaged.
It's a wild world out there.
It is a wild world, and thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been my pleasure.
We'll catch you next time.